Do you know what the auth in OAuth stands for? Spoiler alert, it's not authentication. It's actually authorization. But what even is the difference and why should you care? The first thing that you have to understand is OAuth is not a login. OAuth only tells you what you can do, and an actual login tells you who you are. And people, especially developers, tend to get this confused quite a lot. And in technical terms, you will have something in your cookies stored called access token when you're doing OAuth. And when you're doing an actual login, you will have something called a session ID. Now, an access token actually has stuff allocated to it. For example, the permissions that you have for a certain app. For example, let's say you have a Gmail access token. This token allows you to, for example, read emails, send emails, and that's it. Now you could have a different token that can only read emails. And once again, this is what we call an access token. Now what the session ID would be is literally just the ID of a specific login session. And this session ID belongs to a user, which in turn has an access token. And if you had to label these processes, it would be the Gmail login session authenticates you, but the access token authorizes you to, for example, read your emails. Now that we have this out of the way, let's go ahead and continue with the topic itself. Nice. So now we know that most login with Google buttons are actually not logins. They just give you an access token. And they're not logins unless they follow OIDC. And OIDC basically stands for Open ID Connect. And it's basically just a standard that means in a login flow, you should be authenticated and authorized. So instead of having a login form, or let's do it like this, login, that only authorizes you with a Google access token, it also, let's call it the real login, it also authenticates you. And the difference in practice is that usually you will have an access token and a session ID, and this access token will be saved inside of the session table. So this means that, for example, if I log in using GitHub, I will have a callback function that also creates a user in my own database and saves the access token that you receive from GitHub inside of the sessions table, which then has a sessions ID, which then belongs to the user. And every time you log in, you're not creating a new user, obviously, you're just creating a new session and refresh the access token. And I made a little diagram to show you how this actually looks like in practice. So let's say you have an Next.js app and you want users to be able to log into our app using their GitHub account. And obviously to do that, we will need access to GitHub OAuth. And this is the flow that we want. First, the user clicks on the Continue with GitHub button, our API generates a random state parameter, and this is just a random UUID string to prevent CSRF attacks. Then we set the state cookie in our HTTP cookies, and it's very important to set the state as HTTP only, so it can't really be seen by the user. So for example, if I open the Dev tab and I go into Application, I shouldn't be able to see my state cookie in here. And once we have that, we want to redirect to GitHub. And this seems very vague. So I actually made an example app using Cursor that does this entire workflow. And here's the route that is first called when we click on Continue with GitHub. I can show you real quick that here we have the button or the link that redirects us to API/auth/GitHub. And if you have a look at the routes, this is the one. First, we set our environment variables, which is the client ID, which is provided by GitHub, and the redirect URL. We first, as I said, generate a random state variable and we save it in a constant. And then specifically for GitHub, the URL that you need to use is called github.com/login/auth/authorize. And once again, the terminology comes in handy here. It's authorize and not authenticate. And as the parameters, you need to set client ID, redirect URI, scope, and state. And the important thing here, once again, is scope. You shouldn't be able to do anything with your access token since everybody can authorize using it. So please just always set a very specific scope. And in our case, we just want the user email or the user and the email. And once GitHub replies with a link, we redirect our user to it and we set the state. This is the state that we generate in the beginning and that we send to GitHub. Now GitHub will do their authentication on their backend. Once they're done, they will send a callback action to another route that we have, which is callback. And this is a bit more complex, but it's essentially a very similar thing that you have to do here. And you need to actually set the callback URL in the GitHub auth settings. So if you have a look, you need to set it here. In our case, we're just testing this locally, so I set this as localhost and Next.js is running on port 3000. Anyways, now that GitHub has called our callback route, we first get the code, the state, and an error if it exists. And the code parameter is a very specific and unique code that GitHub generated for us. And later we will use this code to generate an access token. So keep in mind, until now, we still don't have an access token. Now that we're here, we first need to check that the state that we saved in our previous step right here is the same one that we received from GitHub. And GitHub actually sends us this state once again in the callback. Then here we can start exchanging the authorization code for an access token. And the way we do this is we call the access token endpoint under OAuth. We provide our client ID and client secret and the code that we received from them. Then we parse this token response and we have our access token. And this is not really related to the flow itself, but here we fetch the user from GitHub and then we just get a bit of basic data about them using their email. And of course, once again, the access token. Now you could do this without the access token if the user is public, and also you won't get any private data. So to recap, it's not OAuth itself that's bad, but the developers implementing it. Now I'm not gonna sit here and say OAuth is perfect. It could be unified in a way more beautiful and UX friendly way, but that's just how things are at the moment, and we don't really have a better way of connecting to other services that doesn't take ages to set up. If you want to give Shiori a try, here's an 80% discount for your first month, and I'll see you next time.